What happens when a quiet evening in the park takes a sudden turn, uncovering deep-seated injustices and sparking a fight for change? Margaret Ellis, a 72-year-old widow, never imagined she would become the center of a community's call for accountability. A simple misunderstanding spirals into a public confrontation that shakes the Meadow Springs Police Department to its core, forcing its chief, her own son, to make choices that could transform or divide the city forever. Will justice prevail? Will the reforms Samuel Ellis fights for bring lasting change? Or will resistance from within threaten everything they've worked for? Stay tuned to witness an inspiring journey of resilience, accountability, and hope. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Samuel's position? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Now, let's dive into the story. Margaret Ellis sat on the same weathered wooden bench she had visited nearly every evening for years. The small park in Meadow Springs wasn't anything extraordinary, just a handful of trees lining a gravel path, a pond often visited by squawking ducks, and a few scattered benches. But to Margaret, it was her sanctuary, a place where time slowed down and life's hardships softened into whispers. At 72, Margaret had lived a life shaped by resilience. Born in the segregated South, she had witnessed the civil rights marches as a young woman. She had taught history at the local high school for decades, determined to ensure future generations understood the sacrifices made by so many. Her greatest joy, though, was her son, Samuel. Samuel Ellis, now the police chief of Meadow Springs, had risen through the ranks with tenacity and an unyielding sense of justice. Margaret had instilled in him a commitment to fairness and compassion, even in a world that often seemed to lack both. Yet she knew Samuel's position wasn't without its challenges. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, especially in a city still grappling with the complexities of racial inequality. Margaret's fingers gently traced the edge of her scarf as she watched children playing nearby. The park was alive with the laughter of families, the chatter of dog walkers, and the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. She felt a pang of sadness, remembering her late husband, Walter, who used to accompany her to this very bench. Walter had been a quiet but steadfast presence, a man of few words but deep convictions. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the golden light illuminated Margaret's silver hair. Her thoughts wandered to Samuel, imagining him at the precinct, probably buried under paperwork or navigating another crisis. She often worried about him, knowing how deeply he cared about the people he served. Margaret sighed, closing her eyes to savor the gentle breeze. This was her moment of peace, a brief reprieve from the world's noise. She had no way of knowing how quickly that peace would be shattered. Officer Tanner Lewis adjusted the mirror in the patrol car, his expression marked by a casual boredom. Beside him, Officer Ethan Chase scrolled through his phone, occasionally muttering complaints about the lack of excitement in their shift. The dispatcher's call about a suspect had piqued their interest only briefly. The description was vague, a person of interest, possibly in the vicinity of Meadow Springs Park. "Bet it's another false alarm," Chase said, tossing his phone onto the dashboard. Lewis smirked. "Maybe, but let's take a look." A quiet day can turn interesting if you know where to look. As they entered the park's perimeter, their eyes landed on Margaret sitting alone on her bench. Lewis's gaze lingered. She fit nothing about the suspect's description, but something about the image, an elderly black woman sitting quietly, seemed, to him, like an opportunity. "There," Lewis said, nodding toward Margaret. "Perfect." Chase raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking? Let's just talk to her." "Could be her, could not. Either way, it's worth a chat," Lewis said, his tone carrying an edge of mockery. Margaret, lost in her thoughts, didn't notice the patrol car until it stopped near the park's entrance. The two officers stepped out, their presence heavy with authority. They approached her slowly, their boots crunching the gravel. Margaret looked up, her serene expression clouding with confusion. "Good evening, ma'am," Lewis said, his voice cold and clipped. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Margaret adjusted her scarf, her voice calm but puzzled. "Questions? About what, officer?" We've received reports of someone loitering in the area, Chase added, his words sharp. Matches your description. Margaret frowned. I'm just sitting here. I've been coming to this park for years. I don't see how I could match any description. Lewis's smirk widened. Well, you seem to know a lot about this park. A little too comfortable. Maybe. You sure you're not here for other reasons? The insinuation was clear, and Margaret's chest tightened. Other reasons? She echoed, her voice steady but laced with incredulity. I don't understand. Let's not make this difficult, Lewis said. Identification, please. Margaret hesitated, her mind racing. I don't see why I need to show you my ID. I'm not doing anything wrong. Lewis leaned closer, his tone condescending. It's not about what you think, ma'am. It's about what we decide. A small crowd began to gather at a distance. People whispered, their phones subtly raised, capturing the interaction. Margaret noticed the onlookers, her pulse quickening. She took a deep breath, her voice firm but calm. I have every right to sit here without being harassed, she said. Chase chuckled, shaking his head. Harassed? Lady, we're just doing our job. You're making a mistake, Margaret said quietly. Her dignity remained intact, but the weight of the moment pressed on her. Lewis scoffed. Mistake? The only mistake here is thinking you can talk back. Now, are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have a problem? The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. A young woman, clutching her phone tightly, called out, Leave her alone. She's not doing anything. Margaret felt a flicker of hope as more voices joined in, their words blending into a chorus of disapproval. For the first time, Lewis and Chase appeared unsettled. Their smug confidence faltered, but only slightly. I suggest you back off, Lewis snapped at the onlookers. This is police business. The crowd didn't disperse, their collective gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. Margaret straightened her spine, her voice steady and clear. You may have authority, but you don't have the right to treat people this way. I will not be intimidated. At that moment, a figure emerged from the park entrance, Samuel Ellis. His sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation, his steps quickening as he approached. Mom, he called out, his voice heavy with concern. The tension in the air thickened. Samuel's presence would change everything. The crowd's murmur swelled as Samuel Ellis approached, his dark blue blazer and polished shoes in stark contrast to the casual parkgoers. His heart raced as he saw his mother standing upright but visibly strained, facing two officers who seemed to enjoy the tension they were creating. Samuel's voice carried a controlled authority as he called again, Mom, is everything okay? Margaret turned, relief flashing across her face. Samuel, she said softly, her voice a mix of reassurance and weariness. Officer Lewis turned towards Samuel, his eyes narrowing. Who are you, and why are you interrupting an official investigation? Samuel stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He extended his hand, displaying his badge. I'm Samuel Ellis, Chief of Police for Meadow Springs, he said evenly. And this is my mother. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, punctuated by gasps of recognition. Some lowered their phones while others continued to record, their curiosity morphing into shock. Lewis glanced at the badge, then scoffed. Chief of Police? He said, incredulous. That's a good one. You really expect me to believe that? Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. You can radio dispatch and confirm my credentials. Or you can stand down and explain why you're interrogating an elderly woman sitting on a park bench. Chase chuckled, folding his arms. You must think we're fools. Let me guess, you printed that badge online? Margaret, now standing shoulder to shoulder with her son, took a deep breath. These officers stopped me for no reason, she said clearly, her voice projecting strength. I've told them I'm here every day, but they're not interested in hearing that. Lewis smirked. Lady, we don't need a reason to ask questions. It's called doing our job. Samuel's gaze hardened. Doing your job doesn't include targeting someone without cause, he said. His voice, though steady, carried an edge, especially not in a way that violates department policy. The crowd shifted, emboldened by Samuel's presence. A man in a hoodie called out, They're harassing her for no reason. We saw the whole thing. Lewis turned sharply toward the crowd, his voice raised. "Mind your business. All of you. You're interfering with an investigation." Samuel stepped in front of his mother, his calm composure masking his growing anger. "Officer, you're the one who's out of line. This isn't an investigation, it's profiling. And I won't allow it." Chase exchanged a glance with Lewis, his smirk faltering. "Look," Chase said, his tone shifting to feigned patience. "We were just asking questions." She looked suspicious. "Suspicious?" Samuel repeated, his tone incredulous. He gestured to his mother, standing dignified in her neatly pressed cardigan and scarf. "What about her, sitting alone in a park, looks suspicious to you?" The officers didn't respond. The silence that followed was damning, filling the space with an unspoken truth. "You've crossed a line," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away before this becomes a departmental matter." The tension between them was palpable. Lewis looked at Samuel, his bravado slowly unraveling under the weight of the situation. The crowd murmured louder, their phones still raised, capturing every moment. "I'll tell you what's going to happen," Samuel continued. "You're going to step back. You're going to treat my mother with the respect she deserves. And you're going to reconsider how you carry out your duties." Lewis hesitated, his face betraying a mix of defiance and unease. Chase tugged at his partner's sleeve, muttering, "Tanner, let's go. This is getting out of hand." Lewis glanced at the crowd, their disapproving stares pinning him in place. Finally, he stepped back, his expression bitter. "We'll be filing a report," he muttered, turning on his heel. "Do that," Samuel said firmly. "But make sure it's accurate. I'll be checking." The officers retreated to their patrol car, their authority diminished. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers of support ringing out. Margaret felt her shoulders relax, though her heart still raced. Samuel turned to his mother, his voice softening. "Are you okay?" Margaret nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm fine," she said, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "But this isn't over, Samuel. This can't keep happening." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It won't. Not while I'm here." As the patrol car pulled away, the tension in the park began to dissipate. People approached Margaret and Samuel, offering words of support and sharing their recordings of the incident. "You were incredible, ma'am," said a young woman, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for standing up for yourself." Margaret smiled faintly. "It's not just about me," she said. "It's about all of us." Samuel looked at the growing crowd, their voices a mixture of frustration and hope. He knew this incident was a tipping point, one that demanded action beyond the immediate confrontation. As the sun set over Meadow Springs, casting the park in golden hues, Samuel guided his mother away from the bench that had been her refuge. Though shaken, Margaret walked with her head held high, her dignity intact. "I'll take you home," Samuel said as they reached his car. "But tomorrow we're going to address this. Together." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm despite her frailty. "I know you will, son. I trust you." As they drove away, the park behind them buzzed with renewed energy. The confrontation had sparked something deeper, a collective demand for accountability and change. The next morning, Samuel Ellis sat in his office at the Meadow Springs Police Department, staring at the growing stack of reports on his desk. His thoughts, however, were elsewhere on the previous evening's confrontation in the park. He couldn't shake the image of his mother standing firm against the officer's hostility, her dignity intact, but her vulnerability evident. The precinct bustled with the usual morning energy, phones ringing, officers sharing updates, and papers shuffling. Yet, beneath the routine, there was a quiet tension, a sense that yesterday's events had already started rippling through the department. Samuel could feel the weight of it, pressing down on him like a storm cloud. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Lieutenant Emma Harper, his trusted second-in-command, holding a clipboard. Her expression was tight, concern etched into her features. "Morning, Chief," Emma said, stepping into the office. "I thought you want to know there's been some chatter about what happened at the park." Samuel sighed, gesturing for her to sit. "Let me guess. Officers Lewis and Chase?" Emma nodded. Word spread fast. Several people in the community have called in to complain, and we've got multiple videos circulating online. It's not pretty. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. Have they filed a report yet? Emma checked her clipboard. Not yet, but I can push for one if you want. No, Samuel said firmly. Let them make the first move. I want to see how they spin this before we respond. Emma hesitated, then said, Chief, if you don't mind me saying, this isn't just about policy anymore. This is personal. Samuel's gaze softened, but his resolve remained sharp. It's always been personal, Emma. That's why I'm here to make sure this kind of thing doesn't keep happening. Not to my mother, not to anyone. By mid-afternoon, Samuel received word that officers Lewis and Chase had arrived at the precinct. He decided to address the matter head-on, summoning them to his office. The room was quiet when they entered, their postures defensive, their eyes darting around the space as if searching for an escape route. Have a seat, Samuel said, his tone measured but firm. He gestured to the two chairs in front of his desk. Lewis sat stiffly, his jaw set, while Chase slouched slightly, his eyes avoiding Samuel's. Samuel let the silence linger, allowing their discomfort to settle in the air. Do you know why you're here? Samuel finally asked. Lewis spoke first, his voice clipped. We were just doing our job, Chief. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Your job? Last I checked, your job didn't include harassing elderly women in public parks. Lewis stiffened. She fit the description of a suspect. Samuel leaned forward, his voice sharp. You know as well as I do that's a flimsy excuse. And your behavior mocking, dismissive, unprofessional was completely out of line. Do you have any idea who you were speaking to? Chase finally looked up, his face pale. We didn't know she was your mother, sir. That shouldn't matter, Samuel snapped. His voice was calm, but the intensity behind his words was unmistakable. It doesn't matter who she is. What matters is that you treated someone, an innocent person, with disrespect and prejudice. That's not what this department stands for. The weight of Samuel's words hung in the air. For a moment, neither officer spoke. Then Lewis, his tone defensive, said, With all due respect, Chief, we were under a lot of pressure. We didn't mean any harm. Samuel's expression hardened. Intent doesn't erase impact. Do you know how many calls we've received about your behavior? How many videos are circulating, showing exactly what you said and did? Lewis shifted uncomfortably, but Chase muttered, People love to overreact. They don't understand what it's like out there. Samuel's patience thinned. You don't think they understand? They understand perfectly. They understand that officers like you are the reason people don't trust the police. And it's my job to change that. Lewis's eyes narrowed. So, what happens now? Samuel straightened, his tone final. An investigation. Internal Affairs will review the footage, the complaints, and your records. And I'll be recommending disciplinary action. Lewis stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. We've been loyal to this department for years, and you're throwing us under the bus because of one incident? Samuel stood too, his presence towering. One incident? Your records show multiple complaints for similar behavior. This is the last straw. Chase looked like he wanted to disappear. Lewis glared at Samuel for a moment longer before storming out, slamming the door behind him. Chase followed, his head bowed. As the door closed, Samuel exhaled deeply, his anger giving way to a heavy weariness. Emma entered moments later, her expression unreadable. Well, she asked. They'll face consequences, Samuel said. But this is just the beginning. The fallout from the park incident escalated quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the viral videos and interviewing witnesses who condemned the officer's behavior. Community leaders called for transparency, demanding action from the police department. At home, Margaret watched the news coverage with mixed emotions. She felt a surge of pride for her son's decisive stance, but also a lingering sadness that such an incident had occurred at all. When Samuel visited her that evening, she greeted him with a warm but weary smile. You've had quite a day, she said, pouring him a cup of tea. Samuel sank into the armchair across from her, the weight of the day evident in his posture. It's far from over, he said. The community's outraged, and rightfully so. But there's a lot of work to do. Margaret nodded, her hands steady as she passed him the tea. You're doing the right thing, Samuel. but it won't be easy. It never is, he said quietly. He looked at her, his expression softening. How are you holding up? She smiled faintly. I've been through worse, but seeing you stand up for what's right, it reminds me why we keep fighting. Samuel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. This is just the beginning, Mom. We're going to make things better. Margaret squeezed his hand, her voice steady. I know you will. As the night deepened, Samuel sat with his mother, drawing strength from her quiet resilience. The road ahead was daunting, but he was determined to see it through for her, for the community, and for the future of the department he had vowed to lead with integrity. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity. The incident at the park had become the talk of Meadow Springs, sparking debates across social media, community forums, and even city council meetings. For many, Margaret Ellis's treatment was a stark reminder of the systemic issues they had long endured, but rarely seen addressed with accountability. Samuel Ellis found himself walking a tightrope. As chief of police, his every action was scrutinized not just by his officers, but by the public and media as well. He was determined to use the attention to push for meaningful change, but the weight of expectations bore heavily on him. At the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had been indifferent to their colleagues' behavior now seemed to tread carefully, unsure of how the investigation into Officers Lewis and Chase would unfold. Some resented the increased scrutiny, while others quietly supported Samuel's efforts, though few openly voiced their opinions. Lieutenant Emma Harper stood at Samuel's desk one morning, a folder in hand. We've started collecting statements from witnesses at the park, she said. It's damning. People saw and heard everything. Samuel nodded, flipping through the pages of witness accounts. The statements painted a clear picture of bias and misconduct, reinforcing what he already knew. Emma hesitated before speaking again. Chief, I have to ask, how far are you willing to push this? You've got support from the community, but not everyone in the department is on board. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Emma, this isn't about being popular. It's about doing what's right. If we don't address this now, we're just letting it fester. Emma nodded, respect evident in her expression. I'll back you all the way. Just know it's going to get messy. I'm prepared for that, Samuel said. But thank you, Emma. I need people like you in this fight. Meanwhile, the community's response continued to grow. Local activists organized a peaceful rally at Meadow Springs Park, inviting residents to share their stories of encounters with law enforcement. Flyers appeared across the city, urging people to attend and support the cause. On the day of the rally, Margaret sat in her living room, watching coverage of the preparations on TV. Samuel had already left for the precinct, where he planned to address his department before attending the event himself. Margaret's neighbor and longtime friend, Diane Porter, knocked on the door, carrying a casserole dish. Thought you could use some company, Diane said, her voice warm. Margaret smiled, gesturing for her to come in. You didn't have to do that, Diane. Nonsense, Diane replied, setting the dish down on the kitchen counter. You've been through enough this week. It's the least I can do. They sat together at the dining table, the news playing softly in the background. Diane reached across the table, taking Margaret's hand. You're an inspiration, Margaret. What happened to you shouldn't have happened, but the way you've handled it, it's given people hope. Margaret's eyes shimmered with gratitude. I just want things to change, Diane. For Samuel, for everyone. At the rally, a crowd gathered, holding signs with messages like Justice for Margaret and End Profiling Now. The air buzzed with a mix of frustration and determination as speakers took turns addressing the crowd. Samuel arrived toward the middle of the event, his presence drawing applause and whispers. He approached the makeshift stage, his movements purposeful. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, the weight of the moment evident in his demeanor. Good afternoon, he began, his voice clear and steady. My name is Samuel Ellis, and I am the chief of police here in Meadow Springs. But today, I'm speaking not just as an officer, but as a son. The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on him. What happened to my mother in this park was unacceptable, he continued. It was a failure of the officers involved, of the systems in place, and of the values we claim to uphold as a department. And I take responsibility for that. His words resonated, a mix of vulnerability and accountability that disarmed even his critics. "I can't undo what happened," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can promise you this. I will do everything in my power to ensure it doesn't happen again. Not to my mother. Not to anyone." The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering while others wiped away tears. Margaret watched the speech from home, pride and sadness mingling in her heart. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew her son was ready for it. The rally sent ripples through the city, putting additional pressure on the police department to act swiftly. Samuel wasted no time calling a department-wide meeting to address the situation directly. Officers filed into the precinct's briefing room, the tension palpable. Samuel stood at the front, his posture commanding but approachable. Emma Harper stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you all for coming," Samuel began. "I'm sure you're all aware of the incident involving Officers Lewis and Chase. As you know, an internal investigation is underway, and I want to be clear, this is not about personal vendettas. It's about accountability." The room was silent, though a few officers exchanged wary glances. "For too long, misconduct has gone unchecked," Samuel continued. "That ends now. This department must uphold the highest standards of integrity. If we don't, we fail the community we swore to protect, and we fail ourselves." A hand shot up from the back of the room. It was Officer Jake Miller, a veteran known for his outspoken nature. "With all due respect, Chief, some of us feel like we're being thrown under the bus. Not every officer is out there causing problems." Samuel nodded, his tone measured. "You're right, Jake. Not every officer is at fault. But when misconduct happens, it taints all of us. It erodes public trust, and it makes your job and mine more difficult." Another officer, Jessica Morales, spoke up. "Chief, I support what you're doing. But how do we change a culture that's been in place for years? It's not just about policy, it's about people." "That's exactly what we need to address," Samuel said. "Change starts with accountability. It starts with recognizing that the badge is not a shield for bad behavior. And it starts with each of us holding ourselves and each other to a higher standard." The room grew quiet again, the weight of Samuel's words sinking in. Some officers looked thoughtful, while others remained skeptical. As the meeting concluded, Samuel made one final point. "If you have concerns, bring them to me. If you see misconduct, report it. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge. This is our department, and it's up to us to make it better." The early morning light streamed through Samuel Ellis's office window as he sat staring at a blank sheet of paper on his desk. The precinct was quiet, a rare calm before the storm of a busy day. Yet Samuel felt anything but calm. The weight of the investigation into Officers Lewis and Chase bore down on him like a heavy mantle. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "You're doing the right thing, Samuel. But it won't be easy." He had always known his position as the police chief of Meadow Springs came with challenges, but this moment felt particularly isolating. Over the years, he had endured countless slights being questioned in his own department, having his decisions second-guessed simply because of his race. He had persevered, believing that his actions would eventually speak louder than prejudice. But now, sitting in the wake of his mother's public humiliation, Samuel questioned whether the change he fought for was even possible. Could he reform a department entrenched in systemic bias? Could he rebuild trust between the police and a community that felt betrayed? A knock at the door broke his reverie. Emma Harper stepped inside, a cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. "Morning, Chief," she said, setting the coffee on his desk. "Figured you might need this." Samuel offered a faint smile. "Thanks, Emma. What's the latest?" She sat across from him, her tone professional but concerned. "Internal Affairs is making progress. The video evidence is solid, and the witness statements are damning. It's clear Lewis and Chase acted out of bias. The question is, what's next?" Samuel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "What's next is accountability. But that's just the first step. We need to dig deeper, examine how this department got here in the first place." Emma nodded. "That's not going to sit well with everyone." "It doesn't have to," Samuel replied. "But it has to happen. If we don't address the culture, we're just putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound." Emma studied him for a moment before speaking softly. You're carrying a lot, Samuel. You don't have to do it alone. Samuel met her gaze, appreciating her support. Thanks, Emma. But this is personal. It's my mother, my community. If I don't fight for them, who will? While Samuel wrestled with his inner turmoil, the community of Meadow Springs continued to rally. Margaret, though still shaken by the incident, had found herself at the center of a movement. Calls came daily from local leaders, activists, and even national organizations offering support. One evening, Margaret attended a meeting at the local community center. The room buzzed with energy as residents of all ages and backgrounds gathered to share their stories. Many had experienced similar encounters with law enforcement and now saw Margaret as a symbol of resilience. A young woman named Lila Parker stood up to speak. "What happened to Mrs. Ellis could have happened to my grandmother or anyone in this room," she said, her voice trembling. "We've been silent for too long. It's time we demand better." The crowd erupted in applause, their determination palpable. Margaret, seated in the front row, felt a swell of pride mixed with sadness. She hadn't sought to become a symbol, but if her experience could spark change, she was willing to embrace the role. After the meeting, Lila approached Margaret, her expression earnest. "Mrs. Ellis, I just wanted to say thank you. Your courage means so much to all of us." Margaret smiled gently. "It's not just my courage, dear. It's all of ours. Change doesn't happen because of one person, it happens because we stand together." Back at the precinct, Samuel faced mounting resistance from within his ranks. Some officers openly questioned his leadership, while others voiced concerns about what they perceived as an anti-police narrative emerging in the media. One afternoon, during a meeting with senior staff, tensions boiled over. Officer Jake Miller, the outspoken veteran, raised his hand. "With all due respect, Chief," Miller began, "this investigation is tearing the department apart. We've got good officers out there worried about being labeled as racist because of a few bad apples." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "This investigation isn't about labeling anyone. It's about addressing misconduct and restoring trust. If we can't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Miller shook his head. "It just feels like we're being targeted." "You're not being targeted," Samuel replied, his tone firm. "But the community has every right to demand better from us, and it's our responsibility to deliver." The room fell silent, the weight of Samuel's words hanging in the air. Some officers looked thoughtful, while others exchanged skeptical glances. After the meeting, Emma approached Samuel in the hallway. "You handled that well," she said. Samuel sighed. "It's not enough, Emma. There's so much resistance. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the right person for this job." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are. The fact that you're asking these questions means you care. And that's what this department and this community needs." As the investigation into Officers Lewis and Chase progressed, Samuel began implementing changes within the department. He introduced mandatory bias training, established a community advisory board, and launched an anonymous reporting system for officers to hold their peers accountable. The changes were met with mixed reactions. Some officers embraced the reforms, seeing them as a necessary step forward. Others resisted, clinging to the status quo. But Samuel remained steadfast, bolstered by the support of Emma, Margaret, and the community. One day, Samuel received an unexpected visit from Officer Dana Wells, a rookie who had witnessed the park incident and quietly supported Samuel's actions. She stood nervously in his office, clutching a folder. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you," Dana said. "What you're doing is what I signed up for when I joined the force. And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way." Samuel felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Dana. Your support means more than you know." She handed him the folder. "I've been working on some ideas for community outreach programs. I thought you might want to take a look." Samuel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the proposals. He smiled. "These are good, Dana. Let's make them happen." As Dana left the office, Samuel leaned back in his chair, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still daunting, but moments like this reminded him why he had chosen to lead. Margaret Ellis had always been a reluctant hero. She didn't see herself as a leader or an activist, not anymore. Those days seemed behind her, buried under the weight of raising a son as a widow and navigating a society that rarely made space for women like her. But the incident in the park thrust her into a spotlight she couldn't escape, and slowly, she began to embrace it. The calls from community leaders and activists kept coming. Some wanted her to appear at rallies, while others invited her to join panels discussing police reform. At first, Margaret hesitated, unsure if her voice would make a difference. But Samuel's resolve inspired her. If her son could fight for change within the system, she could support him from the outside. One evening, Margaret attended a town hall meeting at a local church. The room was packed with residents, journalists, and city officials. The air buzzed with a mixture of hope and tension. Margaret was seated on the stage alongside other speakers, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret stood slowly, her back straight despite the strain she felt. The microphone crackled as she adjusted it, her voice steady but warm. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I'm here today because of an experience I wish no one had to endure." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Margaret recounted the events at the park not with bitterness, but with clarity. She described how the officers' words had cut deeper than any physical blow, how their disdain had stripped away her dignity in those moments. "But this isn't just about me," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "This is about every person who has felt invisible, unheard, and disrespected. It's about creating a world where my son, a police chief, doesn't have to prove his worth simply because of the color of his skin." Applause erupted, but Margaret held up her hand to quiet the crowd. "I believe we can do better, not just as individuals, but as a community. It starts with accountability, with honesty, and with the courage to demand change." After the meeting, attendees surrounded Margaret, thanking her for her words and sharing their own stories of injustice. Margaret felt a deep sense of connection, realizing that her voice could be a catalyst for unity and progress. Back at the precinct, Samuel continued to navigate the fallout from the park incident. He received daily updates from internal affairs, each one confirming the severity of Officers Lewis and Chase's misconduct. But the deeper issue, the culture within the department, remained a formidable challenge. One afternoon, as Samuel reviewed reports in his office, he was surprised by a knock at the door. It was Sergeant Raymond Brooks, a veteran officer known for his no-nonsense demeanor and, until now, his apparent indifference to Samuel's leadership. "Got a minute, Chief?" Brooks asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Samuel gestured to a chair, his expression wary. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" Brooks sat down, his hands resting on his knees. "I wanted to talk about everything that's been going on, the investigation, the reforms you're pushing." Samuel leaned back in his chair, bracing himself for criticism. "Go on." Brooks hesitated, then said, "Look, I've been on the force for 30 years. I've seen a lot of good cops, and I've seen a lot of bad ones. And I'll admit, when you came in talking about change, I wasn't sure how to take it." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Brooks sighed. "Now I see that you're serious. And you're right, we've let too much slide for too long. I've been complicit in that, thinking it wasn't my problem as long as I kept my head down. But this department needs a wake-up call, and I want to help." Samuel's surprise was evident, but he quickly masked it. "That means a lot, Sergeant. What changed your mind?" Brooks looked him in the eye. "Your mother. The way she handled herself, dignified, strong, that stuck with me. And the way you've stood your ground. It made me realize I've been part of the problem by staying silent." Samuel nodded, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "Then let's start changing things together." The two men spent the next hour discussing ways to implement meaningful reforms. Brooks offered insights into the department's inner workings, identifying areas where accountability had faltered. By the end of the conversation, Samuel felt more confident that change was possible. As the investigation into Officers Lewis and Chase neared its conclusion, Samuel doubled down on his efforts to rebuild trust within the community. He held a series of town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their concerns and propose solutions. At one meeting, a young man named Derek Coleman stood up to speak. "Chief Ellis, I appreciate what you're trying to do," he said. "But how do we know these changes will last? How do we know they won't just be empty promises? Samuel nodded, understanding the skepticism. That's a fair question, Derek. And the truth is, I can't fix everything overnight. But I can promise you this. As long as I'm in this position, I will hold this department accountable. And I'll work to make sure the systems we put in place can't be easily undone. Margaret, seated in the front row, felt a swell of pride as she listened to her son. His words carried the weight of conviction, and she could see the impact they had on the audience. After the meeting, Derek approached Samuel. "I'll hold you to that, Chief," he said, shaking his hand. "We all will." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Samuel replied with a small smile. The internal affairs investigation into officers Tanner Lewis and Ethan Chase concluded in a flurry of press releases and public statements. The report confirmed what the community had already seen in the viral videos: racial bias, misconduct, and a blatant disregard for protocol. Lewis and Chase were found guilty of violating department policies, including inappropriate conduct during a public interaction and the failure to verify Samuel Ellis's credentials as police chief. As Samuel read through the final report in his office, he felt a mix of vindication and lingering frustration. The findings validated his stance, but they also highlighted the deep-rooted issues within his department. It wasn't just about two officers, it was about a culture that had allowed such behavior to persist. Emma Harper knocked on his door, stepping inside with a cautious expression. "The press is waiting," she said. "They want to know what happens next." Samuel stood, adjusting his tie. "Then let's tell them." The press conference took place in the precinct's briefing room, where reporters and community members packed every available space. Samuel stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "Today, I'm here to address the conclusion of the internal affairs investigation into officers Tanner Lewis and Ethan Chase. After a thorough review, it has been determined that their actions violated the values and policies of this department. Effective immediately, both officers have been terminated." The crowd murmured, and flashes from cameras lit the room. Samuel continued, "This decision is not just about accountability for two individuals, it's about sending a message that misconduct and prejudice have no place in law enforcement. We are here to serve and protect, not to harm or intimidate." A reporter raised a hand. "Chief Ellis, do you believe this will restore trust in the department?" Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is a step in the right direction, but trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It's earned through consistent actions. That's why this department is implementing new measures, including mandatory training on implicit bias and an independent community oversight board." Margaret watched the press conference from home, pride swelling in her chest. She knew her son was taking on an enormous challenge, but his courage and integrity gave her hope. The firing of Lewis and Chase sent ripples through Meadow Springs. While many praised the decision, others criticized it as overly harsh. The debate spilled into community forums, coffee shops, and even city council meetings. But amidst the controversy, one thing became clear: the conversation about police reform was unavoidable now. Margaret found herself at the center of this movement, attending events and speaking to small groups about her experience. One evening, she was invited to a panel discussion at the Meadow Springs Library, where community leaders, activists, and law enforcement representatives gathered to discuss the path forward. Margaret sat on the panel beside Samuel, who had agreed to participate despite his busy schedule. The moderator, a journalist named Caroline McKenzie, began the discussion with a pointed question. "Mrs. Ellis, what do you think is the most important change that needs to happen in our city?" Margaret adjusted her scarf, her expression thoughtful. "We need to remember that we're all human," she said. "It sounds simple, but it's the hardest thing to practice, seeing each other as people, not labels or assumptions. That's the foundation for any real change." The audience nodded, and Samuel couldn't help but smile. His mother's wisdom always seemed to cut through the noise. Later in the evening, Samuel addressed a question from a young man in the audience. "Chief Ellis, how do you handle the pressure from within your own department? Aren't there officers who don't agree with what you're doing?" Samuel nodded, his expression serious. "Absolutely. Change isn't easy, and not everyone welcomes it. But I believe that most officers want to do the right thing. It's my job to lead by example and show them that accountability makes us stronger, not weaker. The panel ended with a standing ovation, leaving Samuel and Margaret feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Despite the progress being made, tensions within the police department reached a boiling point. One morning, Samuel arrived at the precinct to find a group of officers gathered in the hallway, their voices hushed but angry. At the center of the group was Jake Miller, the veteran officer who had previously voiced his concerns about the investigation. Samuel approached, his presence immediately silencing the group. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone firm but calm. Miller stepped forward, his expression defiant. "Chief, we've been talking. Some of us feel like this department's priorities are out of balance. We're out there risking our lives, and all we hear about is how we're failing." Samuel folded his arms, his gaze steady. "Jake, this isn't about failure, it's about improvement. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, we lose the trust of the people we serve. And without that trust, we can't do our jobs effectively." Miller shook his head. "It's not that simple. Morale is low, and some of us feel like we're being unfairly targeted." Samuel took a step closer, lowering his voice but not his resolve. "I understand that change is uncomfortable, but if you're more concerned about morale than about integrity, you're in the wrong line of work." The group fell silent, and Miller finally backed down, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. Samuel turned to Emma, who had been watching from a distance. "Schedule another department meeting," he said. "It's time we had another honest conversation." The confrontation left Samuel exhausted but determined. He knew the road to reform would be fraught with resistance, but he was committed to seeing it through. Meanwhile, Margaret achieved a milestone of her own. The city council invited her to speak at a session focused on community police relations, recognizing her as a voice of reason and compassion. Margaret stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges as she addressed the council and the audience. "I never imagined I'd be here," she began. "But life has a way of calling us to action when we least expect it. My experience in the park wasn't unique, and that's why I'm here to ensure it becomes a rarity rather than a norm." Her speech was met with thunderous applause, and several council members pledged their support for Samuel's reforms. For Margaret, it was a deeply personal victory, a sign that her ordeal had not been in vain. The events surrounding the firings of Officers Lewis and Chase continued to reverberate throughout Meadow Springs. Some community members praised Samuel's decisive action, seeing it as a long overdue step toward accountability. Others, especially within certain factions of the police department, resented the shift, framing it as an attack on their authority. Samuel felt this divide acutely. His office had become a revolving door of meetings, with officers expressing concerns, community leaders urging further action, and city officials navigating public expectations. Every conversation felt like a balancing act, with Samuel walking a fine line between pushing for reform and maintaining departmental cohesion. One evening, Samuel attended a meeting organized by Lila Parker, the young activist who had spoken at the earlier rally. Held in the community center's largest hall, the meeting drew residents from all walks of life. Samuel arrived to find a buzz of anticipation. Many were eager to see whether the police chief would continue to engage directly with the public. Lila approached him as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile. "Chief Ellis, I wasn't sure you'd come." Samuel returned the smile, his demeanor warm despite the weight on his shoulders. "I said I'd listen, and I meant it." The meeting began with residents sharing their experiences, many recounting incidents of profiling or mistreatment. Others spoke about the broader need for structural change, advocating for measures like independent oversight and de-escalation training. When it was Samuel's turn to speak, he stepped to the front of the room, pausing to take in the faces of those gathered. "Thank you all for sharing your stories," he began. "Hearing them reinforces why this work is so important and why it's so difficult." He took a breath, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Change doesn't happen because of one person or one policy. It happens when a community comes together, when we hold each other accountable and refuse to accept the status quo. A man in the audience raised his hand. "But what about the officers who resist? How do you change their minds?" Samuel's expression grew serious. "You can't always change minds overnight. But you can change behavior through accountability. And over time, when people see the impact of doing things the right way, their attitudes often follow. The meeting ended with a standing ovation, and Samuel stayed long after to speak with residents individually. Margaret, who had accompanied him, watched with pride as her son listened intently to each person, offering thoughtful responses and words of reassurance. As they walked to their car afterward, Margaret placed a hand on Samuel's arm. "You're making a difference," she said, "even if it doesn't always feel that way." Samuel smiled down at her, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I hope so, Mom. I really do." Just when Samuel thought the department was beginning to turn a corner, a new controversy erupted. A senior officer, Lieutenant Mark Henderson, was caught on video making dismissive comments about the recent reforms during a private conversation that had been inadvertently recorded. The video quickly spread online, reigniting tensions both inside and outside the department. Samuel called an emergency meeting with his leadership team, his frustration evident. "This undermines everything we've been working toward," he said, pacing the room. "How can we expect the community to trust us if our own leaders are resisting the changes?" Emma Harper, ever the voice of reason, spoke up. "We need to address this head-on, Chief. If we ignore it, it'll only fester." Samuel nodded, his mind racing. "Prepare a statement for the press. I'll meet with Henderson privately, but there will be consequences." The meeting with Henderson was tense. The lieutenant, a decorated officer with decades of service, initially tried to downplay his comments. "It was a private conversation, Chief. I didn't mean for it to get out." Samuel's gaze was steely. "Intent doesn't change impact, Mark. Your words reflect an attitude that's completely at odds with the values we're trying to uphold." Henderson bristled. "With all due respect, Chief, not everyone agrees with these reforms. Morale is already low, and now this makes it worse." Samuel didn't flinch. Morale isn't an excuse for misconduct or resistance to accountability. If you can't support this department's mission, then you don't belong in a leadership role. The meeting ended with Henderson agreeing to issue a public apology and accepting a suspension. While it was a difficult decision, Samuel knew it was necessary to send a clear message. As the fallout from the Henderson controversy settled, the community organized another rally, this time focused on supporting Samuel's reforms and celebrating Margaret's resilience. The event was held in the city's main square, drawing a diverse crowd of residents, activists, and city officials. Margaret was invited to speak again, and this time she stood with an air of quiet confidence. "I've lived long enough to know that progress doesn't come easily," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But I've also learned that it's worth fighting for. What happened to me wasn't just about one moment, it was about a system that needs to change. And I believe we can change it together." Samuel followed his mother, his speech blending accountability with hope. "This department isn't perfect," he said. "But perfection isn't the goal, progress is. And with your support, we can keep moving forward." The rally ended with a powerful sense of unity, the crowd chanting, "Justice for all," as the sun set over Meadow Springs. In the weeks following the second rally, Meadow Springs began to feel the early effects of Samuel Ellis's reforms. The police department underwent significant changes, with new policies emphasizing transparency, accountability, and community engagement. Officers attended mandatory workshops on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and cultural competency. While some resisted the changes, many embraced them, seeing them as a chance to rebuild trust and strengthen the department's integrity. One of the first initiatives Samuel launched was a mentorship program pairing veteran officers with recruits. The goal was to foster mutual understanding and encourage open dialogue about the challenges of modern policing. Sergeant Raymond Brooks became a key advocate for the program, using his decades of experience to guide younger officers. At a department meeting, Brooks stood to address his colleagues. "I've been on this force for 30 years, he said, his voice steady. "I've seen how things were and how they need to change. It's not about tearing anyone down, it's about building something better. We owe that to the people we serve." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Samuel felt a surge of gratitude for Brooks's leadership, knowing that allies like him were crucial to the department's transformation. Margaret Ellis, too, found herself at the forefront of change. Her story had captured the hearts of many, and she used her newfound platform to advocate for broader reforms. She began working with local organizations, hosting workshops on community police relations, and speaking at schools about the importance of empathy and understanding. One afternoon, Margaret visited Meadow Springs High School, her alma mater, to address a group of students. Standing before a room of eager young faces, she shared her experience with grace and honesty. "I never thought I'd be standing here, speaking to you all about what happened to me," she said. "But life has a way of calling us to action when we least expect it. What matters is how we respond." A student raised her hand. "Mrs. Ellis, do you think things will really change?" Margaret smiled gently. "I believe they can, but change takes time and effort. It's up to all of us to hold each other accountable and to never lose sight of our shared humanity." Afterward, students crowded around her, asking questions and sharing their own stories. Margaret left the school with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her voice was inspiring a new generation to fight for justice. Despite the progress being made, the road was not without setbacks. One evening, Samuel received word of an incident involving a young officer who had mishandled a routine traffic stop, escalating it unnecessarily. The incident, though minor compared to past cases, reignited criticism from both the community and within the department. Samuel called an emergency meeting with his leadership team. "This is exactly why we need to keep pushing," he said. "One misstep can undo months of progress. We can't afford to lose the community's trust." Emma Harper, always pragmatic, nodded. "We need to address this quickly and transparently. Show the public that we're serious about accountability." The young officer was disciplined and required to attend additional training. Samuel held a press conference to address the incident, reiterating the department's commitment to reform. "This isn't about punishing individuals, it's about setting a standard," he said. "Every officer who wears this badge represents this department and this community. We must strive to do better." The incident served as a reminder that the journey toward justice was ongoing, but Samuel remained steadfast in his resolve. As the months passed, the impact of Samuel's leadership and Margaret's advocacy became evident. Complaints against the department decreased, while community satisfaction rose. Officers who had once resisted the changes began to see the benefits of a more transparent and accountable approach. At a city council meeting, Samuel presented a progress report on the department's reforms. "We're not where we need to be yet," he said, "but we're on the right path. And with your continued support, we'll get there." The council commended his efforts, and several members spoke about the positive feedback they had received from constituents. After the meeting, Margaret approached Samuel, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done so much good, Samuel. Your father would be so proud." Samuel smiled, his voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You've been my anchor through all of this." They embraced, a quiet moment of connection amidst the noise of progress. The story of Margaret Ellis and her son Samuel became a beacon of hope, not just for Meadow Springs, but for communities across the nation. News outlets featured their journey as an example of how individuals could inspire systemic change. Their work sparked similar initiatives in neighboring cities, creating a ripple effect of reform. One sunny afternoon, Margaret returned to the park where it all began. She sat on her favorite bench, the sunlight filtering through the trees. The park was lively, filled with families, joggers, and children playing. It no longer felt like a place of pain, but a symbol of resilience. Samuel joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be here," he said, handing her a cup. Margaret smiled. "It's peaceful here. It reminds me of why we started this journey." They sat in companionable silence, watching the world go by. After a while, Margaret spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think we've done enough?" Samuel shook his head. "There's always more to do. But we've built something strong, something that will last." Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then that's enough for now." As the sun dipped lower, casting golden hues across the park, Samuel and Margaret sat together, united by their shared mission and the knowledge that they had made a difference. Months later, a ceremony was held to dedicate a new community center in Meadow Springs, named in honor of Margaret Ellis. The building would house programs aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community, offering resources for education, dialogue, and healing. Margaret stood at the podium, her voice filled with emotion. This center isn't just about me, it's about all of us. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, we can come together to create something better. As the audience applauded, Samuel stood in the front row, his heart swelling with pride. He knew the journey wasn't over, but together, he and his mother had laid the foundation for a brighter future. If Margaret and Samuel's story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on how small acts of courage can lead to big changes. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters more than you know. What do you think about the changes Samuel made? Do you believe similar reforms could work in other communities? Share your perspective below. If you found this story meaningful, give this video a thumbs up. It helps us create more stories that highlight resilience, justice, and hope. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful and heartfelt stories like this one. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Let's continue the conversation about accountability, community, and the power of standing together. Together, we can inspire change.